Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. The first arrests of the impeachment era happened today. Two suspects nabbed by the FBI at a Washington, D.C. airport attempting to leave the country with one-way tickets. Get this, only hours after they lunched with their business associate and lawyer, Rudy Giuliani. Let me take a minute to explain these two suspects who probably are not that familiar to you. They've been floating around the coverage of the Ukraine scandal. They've been close to Rudy Giuliani from the very beginning. Lev Parnas on the left was born in Ukraine. Igor Fruman on the right was born in Belarus. They're American citizens, naturalized. They're described in the federal indictment and in reporting as businessmen, although, to be honest, their current business is sort of unclear. They've been working hand in hand, tightly, with Rudy Giuliani on the Ukraine operation since the very beginning. They've been setting up meetings in Ukraine, acting as intermediaries abroad, meeting with people in the Trump circle. They have been a crucial part of the scheme by Rudy Giuliani and President Trump to apply maximal pressure to the Ukrainian government to manufacture dirt on the president's political rival to interfere in the next election so that Trump could win re-election. They've been part of this impeachable act from the beginning. They've been so integral to it that shortly after the indictment was reported, they were subpoenaed by the House committees leading the impeachment investigation. In fact, today was the day that this guy on the left, not the one with the saucily unbuttoned shirt, the guy who's dressed a little more modestly, he was supposed to give a deposition before those committees. The guy with the open shirt was supposed to do that tomorrow. Oh, and yes, that is Don Jr. on the other side of the table with those gentlemen. Anyway, those two guys were supposed to give depositions before the House today and tomorrow. But a few days ago, the president's former lawyer, and now these gentlemen's lawyer, John Dowd, wrote a letter to Congress in the most professional font, Comic Sans, explaining that they couldn't appear because, and I'm quoting here, Messieurs Parnas and Fruman assisted Mr. Giuliani in connection with his representation of President Trump. In other words, they are part of the president's legal team, one big happy family representing the president, and that's why they can't testify before Congress. And I'm quoting their own lawyer here. I'm not making this up. He said it. They assisted Mr. Giuliani in connection with his representation of President Trump. So you can't talk to them, Congress. Sorry. That was a week ago, okay? And the Wall Street Journal, which broke this whole story this morning, reports that those two gentlemen had lunch with Giuliani himself at the Trump International Hotel in Washington on Wednesday. That would be yesterday, Giuliani and the two men having lunch. And then we know from the U.S. attorney, hours later, that's hours after lunch with Giuliani at the Trump Hotel, Parnas and Fruman were arrested at a D.C. airport as they were about to board an international flight with one-way tickets. Now, what they are indicted for is a scheme to funnel foreign money into American elections. Interesting. They're trying to have foreign nationals, foreign governments maybe, meddle in American elections. Here's how the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Jeffrey Berman, a Trump appointee, explained it.
As alleged in the indictment, the defendants broke the law to gain political influence while avoiding disclosure of who was actually making the donations and where the money was coming from. They sought political influence not only to advance their own financial interests, but to advance the political interests of at least one foreign official, a Ukrainian government official who sought the dismissal of the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine.
They were advocating for the dismissal of the U.S. ambassador of Ukraine. That sure sounds familiar. Oh, right. It's because the Journal reported last week that Trump himself ordered that U.S. ambassador to Ukraine removed after complaints from Giuliani and, quote, others. Take a listen to how the president responded today when asked about his communications with men who were, again, according to their own lawyer, part of the president's legal team.
What conversations have you had with Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman?
I don't know those gentlemen.
You're in pictures with them.
Now, it's possible I have a picture with them because I have a picture with everybody. I don't know them. I don't know about them. I don't know what they do. But I don't know. Maybe they were clients of Rudy. You'd have to ask Rudy. I just don't know.
Sorry to this man. It's true. The president isn't going to remember everyone who takes a picture with him, and the vice president and his personal attorney and his son. But you would think he would remember members of his legal team who had dinner with him personally just last spring, right before they donated to his super PAC. So just to keep track of all this. Two men from the former USSR who told Congress they were part of the president's legal team and who have been working actively with Rudy Giuliani to push the Ukraine scandal that now has the president on the edge of impeachment were arrested last night while attempting to leave the country with one-way tickets. Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.